In 1775, something extraordinary happened. The American Revolution had begun, and the Continental Army marched north into Canada, expecting an easy victory. They believed Canadians would rise up and join them. After all, both colonies were ruled by Britain. Both lived on the same continent. Both had been shaped by the same imperial system. But the revolutionaries were wrong. The invasion collapsed. Canada did not rebel. And that raises a fascinating historical question. Why did one British colony revolt, while another stayed loyal? The answer reveals something deeper about how empires actually work. Because Canada wasn't just another colony, it played a completely different role in the British imperial system. And that difference shaped the future of North America. To understand why Canada didn't rebel, we need to go back to 1763. That year marked the end of the 7 Years' War, one of the largest global conflicts of the 18th century. Britain defeated France and gained control of a vast territory in North America, New France. This territory would become modern Canada. But here's something surprising. At the time, Britain wasn't even sure it wanted Canada. In fact, British politicians seriously debated giving it back to France. Why? Because Canada looked like a terrible investment. It was cold. Its population was tiny, only about 65,000 French settlers. Its economy was limited mostly to fur trading and small-scale agriculture. Compared to other colonies, it simply wasn't very profitable. In fact, a single Caribbean sugar island could generate more wealth than all of Canada combined. Sugar plantations were some of the most profitable enterprises in the world. Canada was not. So why did Britain keep it? Because Canada had something far more valuable than profit. It had strategic power. And by the 1760s, Britain had already begun to see warning signs coming from its American colonies. For generations, the American colonies had developed strong local assemblies, thriving merchant networks, and a culture of self-government. Colonists were used to running their own affairs. They often ignored imperial trade restrictions, built smuggling networks, and pushed the limits of British authority. Earlier uprisings, like Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, had already shown how quickly colonial tensions could turn violent. From London's perspective, North America was becoming politically volatile, and that made geography suddenly very important. Canada gave Britain control of the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, the main strategic gateway into the interior of the continent. It provided strategic depth, a northern defensive shield, and a military base that could secure Britain's position in North America if the southern colonies became unstable. In other words, Canada wasn't primarily an economic colony, it was a security asset. And that difference would shape its entire history. Now compare that to the American colonies. By the mid-1700s, they had become one of the most economically dynamic regions in the British Empire. The colonies produced tobacco, rice, indigo, timber, and vast amounts of agricultural output. Major port cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York were thriving centers of trade. Merchants operated shipping networks that stretched across the Atlantic. Plantation owners accumulated enormous landholdings and wealth, and the population was exploding. By 1775, the American colonies contained roughly 2.5 million people. Canada had fewer than 100,000. That difference mattered enormously because scale changes the political character of a colony. Large populations create dense economic networks. Cities grow, trade expands, wealth accumulates, and with wealth comes influence. Colonial merchants, landowners, and political leaders begin forming powerful local interests that don't always align with imperial policy. In other words, the American colonies were no longer small outposts of empire. They had become complex societies with their own economic momentum. Canada was completely different. When Britain took control of Canada in 1763, the colony had been part of the French Empire for over a century. And the French colonial system looked very different from the British one. Under French rule, Canada had no elected assemblies. Authority flowed directly from the French crown. Political participation was limited. The Catholic Church played a major role in social life, and local governance was much more centralized. This meant that when Britain took over, French Canadians weren't losing democratic rights. They had never had them in the first place. Their main concern wasn't political representation, it was cultural survival. Would the new British rulers force them to abandon their religion? And would they lose their legal system? Would they be absorbed into a foreign culture? Britain faced a difficult choice. They could try to assimilate the French population, or they could accommodate them, and Britain chose accommodation. In 1774, Britain passed the Quebec Act. This law allowed French Canadians to keep their Catholic religion. It preserved French civil law. And it allowed traditional French elites to maintain influence in colonial society. In most parts of the British Empire, Catholics faced significant restrictions. But in Canada, Britain made an exception. Why? Because stability mattered more than cultural conformity. Britain needed Canada to remain loyal, especially as tensions with the American colonies were rising rapidly. From Britain's perspective, Canada was strategically vital. So instead of provoking conflict, Britain offered concessions. And those concessions worked. French Canadians had little reason to join a revolution led largely by English-speaking Protestants. If the American rebels won, French Canadians feared they might lose the protections Britain had granted them. Joining the revolution could mean becoming a minority under a new government that might not respect their culture or religion. So, when the American Revolution began, most Canadians stayed neutral or sided with Britain. But something else happened that shaped Canada's future even more. After the American Revolution ended in 1783, tens of thousands of Loyalists fled north. These were colonists who had supported the British Crown during the war. They rejected the revolution and they preferred monarchy over republican government, and many of them settled in Canada. This migration had a powerful cultural effect. English-speaking Canada was now populated by people who had consciously chosen loyalty over rebellion. That decision would shape Canadian political culture for generations. But perhaps the most important lesson of the American Revolution was learned in London. Britain had just lost one of its most valuable colonies. The war had been incredibly expensive, and it had triggered a global conflict involving France and Spain. From the British perspective, the message was clear. Trying to tightly control wealthy settler colonies was dangerous. It could lead to rebellion, and rebellion could lead to the loss of entire regions. So Britain changed its strategy. Instead of ruling powerful colonies directly, Britain began allowing them greater autonomy. This new model eventually became known as the Dominion system. Under this system, colonies gained control over their internal affairs. They could run their own parliaments, so they could manage local taxation and domestic policy, but they remained inside the broader imperial system. They shared the British monarch. They cooperated on defense, and they stayed connected economically. Canada became the first major example of this new imperial strategy. In 1867, Canada gained self-government through confederation. Over the next decades, it gradually gained full legislative independence. This process was slow, negotiated, and peaceful. Canada didn't jump suddenly from colony to independent nation. Instead, it evolved step by step: colony, dominion, autonomous partner, fully sovereign country. This gradual transition reveals something important about how the British Empire adapted. Empires often rely on direct control early in their expansion, but over time, maintaining direct rule becomes expensive and risky. So successful empires evolve. They shift from controlling territory to shaping networks, from governing directly to influencing indirectly. The British Empire became less about owning land and more about maintaining economic and political alignment. Canada was the prototype of this transformation. It showed how an empire could retain influence without constant coercion. So, when we ask why Canada didn't rebel like America, the answer isn't simple. Canada had fewer wealthy elites, its economy was smaller and less concentrated, its population was smaller, its political traditions were different. Britain offered strategic concessions. And after the American Revolution, loyalists reshaped Canadian society. But the most important reason may be this: Britain learned from its mistakes. The American Revolution taught Britain that rigid imperial control could destroy an empire. So Britain adapted. Instead of pushing Canada toward rebellion, Britain gave it room to grow inside the imperial system. Different incentives produced a different outcome. America fought a revolution. Canada negotiated a transformation. And in that contrast, we can see something profound about the evolution of modern empires. Sometimes power survives not by tightening control, but by letting it go.